This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
Well, I can at least say this about Dynamite this week. They created some buzz. Now, whether or not that's going to generate any productivity or long-term sustainable income for the product is yet to be determined. Probably won't, because I think the cat's already kind of out of the bag with AEW. And I've talked about it plenty of times now, where they're pretty much set with their current fan base, and even with the occasional ratings pops they get here and there, the new signees and the former WWE rejects that come in, usually by the end, things peter out and kind of wind back up exactly where AEW's numbers usually hit. There's a lot to get into with that show this week, and by that I primarily mean one segment. But in the case that you are checking out the show for the first time, allow me to welcome you all to the Five Starr Wrestling Report podcast. We are on YouTube and Rumble each Monday and Friday for new shows and new content. As always, subscriptions are great, and I highly encourage anyone that likes the show to stick around, subscribe, and run that whole gamut. However, even if you just give the show a like and leave a comment down below, you'll definitely help me out, specifically on the YouTube algorithms. Also on the docket for today, we have the Retro Review Series continuation, which is definitely going to come in handy after we talk about what modern wrestling is doing to try and generate revenue these days. Compare that to a time when the people in the business just knew how to write good content, make stars, write good stories, and make wrestling one of the hottest markets out there. And it's because of the bullshit like we see on AEW most weeks that explain why the business sucks now and why no one could possibly care about professional wrestling in 2022. It's a sad state of affairs, but I think one thing's evident. The Bill Wattses and the Bob Geigels and the Jim Crockett Seniors and the Paul Bosches and the Sam Muchnicks, they were once-in-a-lifetime kind of people. And they're certainly better at doing their jobs than whatever Tony Khan is allowing to happen in his company. So why don't we just dive into this atrocity and figure out just what in the hell Tony Khan is trying to do with All Elite Wrestling. And as per usual with AEW, coming off of a pay-per-view from Sunday night, 13 or 14 matches, multiple debuts, 1,000 things that went down in almost a 5-hour time frame, you would think that, maybe you want to spend about 5 minutes of your follow-up show recapping some of the things that went down on that pay-per-view. It would seem like the most logical thing to do if you were a wrestling company that had a clue. Talk about some of the matches, show some highlights, some interviews or pre-tapes with the boys, the winners and the losers. Maybe, maybe catch us all up in case there were people that didn't buy the pay-per-view, because the only people buying AEW's pay-per-views at this point are the hardcore marks. And I guess me, because I hate myself. No, instead, after watching a bunch of matches on a show, we begin Dynamite this week with more matches. A cold open 6-man tag. It's CM Punk and FTR versus the Ass Boys and Max Caster. And by the way, of the 6 men involved in this match, not a single one of them was booked for the pay-per-view this past Sunday, omitting Punk. And if you have not been following any of the stuff with the Guns and the Acclaimed recently, you would probably have no idea why Anthony Bowens is in a wheelchair. I actually forgot about that until I remember the 10-second pre-tape they aired on Rampage where Bowens was just on the ground clutching his knee for reasons. They never explained what happened. They never updated us on the condition of Bowens' injury. He's just in a wheelchair now. Because. Or maybe he's legitimately hurt and I would have no idea because, again, no one bothers to fucking explain anything in this stupid company. And this was generally a good tag opener if you can get past the ridiculous over-the-top cartooniness that is the Acclaimed and the Guns. I will give them credit where it's due. They're decent workers, especially Austin and Colton Gunn. You know, they're young lions. They clearly need a lot more ring experience, but they actually have potential to be a solid tag duo for this company. Are they ever going to be on FTR level? No, probably not, but they'll sure be a whole lot better than most of the low-functioning idiots they've got on the roster right now. I did like Dax and Cash using the old Midnight Express top rope front power slam that Dennis used to do. It's always good to know that someone watches old tapes and actually tries to be good at their jobs occasionally in this business. Heels ended up working over Dax for a little bit, and that was fine. And of course, as soon as they get the hot tag to Punk, he flubs the springboard off the ropes immediately, and the hot tag becomes a crop dust. I don't know. He's got to stop doing some of that high-risk stuff because I have seen him fuck up that springboard before, and it totally takes the air out of the room when he messes up stuff like that. I mean, he recovered all right. There was another weird-looking spot at the end where Punk tried to shove one of the heels into Billy Gunn on the ring apron, and I don't know, either Billy forgot the bump or they just didn't plan it out well, so after the guy collided with Billy, he just went, oh shit, well, I mean, I guess I should fall down to make it look like something happened. So the faces win, and then Punk does a promo saying that he's got some ring resting kinks to work out still, but regardless of the way that people think of him, whether it's cheering or booing, they do have to acknowledge that he is now the champ. And then Dax did a not-so-great promo where he basically said, aside from his wife and kid, there's nothing more important to him than pro wrestling. And right before he capped off, he name-dropped Finlay. I guess issuing a challenge or something like that, but when I first heard the name Finlay, I thought, isn't Fit Finlay retired? And moreover, isn't he a road agent for WWE right now? I guess he meant the other Finlay of New Japan fame. Because, you know, everyone knew who Dax was talking about except for, well, you know, everyone. And because they've got to hotshot a bunch of shit for their Forbidden Door pay-per-view in like 3 or 4 weeks, Punk immediately calls out his hand-picked opponent for the show, who apparently just so happened to be standing by the entrance tunnel before this, and it's Hiroshi Tanahashi. And who is Hiroshi Tanahashi? Well, if you don't watch New Japan, you're probably scratching your head right now wondering, why should I care? And the answer is, you shouldn't. Now, because I've actually watched New Japan from time to time, and I have seen a handful of Tanahashi matches in my day, I can at least chime in with some sort of opinion on the matter. I mean, look, not trying to discredit the guy because I've seen some good Tanahashi matches before, but that was also like 10 years ago when the guy was younger and more mobile. The Hiroshi Tanahashi work I saw from his performance in the G1 last year was not all that great from what I remember. And the guy's what? Like in his mid-40s now? Like, no offense, but is this really the best opponent for a CM Punk? They might work well together, but Punk's had a string of problematic matches lately, and unless they're going to keep things as bare bones old school as humanly possible, I'm kind of on the fence about this one. I think a lot of people were expecting Okada to be Punk's opponent, and quite frankly, maybe that would have been a better option. And I'm not really an Okada guy myself, but when you compare the two, Tanahashi versus Okada, I at least know that Okada can move well, and he's usually had really good main event level matches. So maybe Tanahashi wasn't the first plan, but I really don't know what to make out of it. I would hope they're smart enough to clue some people in and show a couple video packages before the pay-per-view to let us know who the fuck Tanahashi is and why we should care that he's wrestling CM Punk in the main event of their next big show, but well, I'm just going to leave that out in the open and they can figure it out. And then we had Sir Maxwell Friedman out for an interesting worked shoot. And, well, there's a lot to unpack here. And this was probably the one segment on the show where after it initially happened, I didn't even really know where to start taking notes with it. There was a lot there, and I mean, it's almost kind of its own topical discussion alone because there's so much intricate detail with everything. I guess I'll start with this. And again, this is nitpicky old school fan watching. You know, someone that pays special attention to the subtleties and details in wrestling that actually kind of matter at the end of the day. I was already very iffy on MJF actually making a physical appearance here after what happened at the pay-per-view, but if they were going to bother to go through with the stretcher job and try to milk the aftermath deal with him getting carted off, I don't know, you couldn't at least have the guy come out with a back brace on or something? Like, someone like MJF should really have been a stickler for that too, because he's someone that actually gets the small things in the business. I mean, he didn't even limp out or sell anything. It's like that match with Wardlow never even happened. I don't know, it kind of made me roll my eyes. In the grand scheme of it, I can look past it because it's not really important here. Basically, the nutshell summary of the whole deal was MJF did his version of a well-crafted, well-executed work shoot on a lot of things on that matter. He dropped a lot of Jim Cornette one-liners. He talked about the fact that when the company first started, every mud show outlaw guy on the indie scene got signed to a contract when they had no business getting one to begin with. True. He talked about being a 26-year-old prodigy and that while all the boys in the back could be good to great, MJF had to be perfect with everything he did because he's essentially the only one that's been carrying this company on his back for the better part of a year. Also true. He called out a lot of the fans that were doing the dueling chants because the same people that were cheering him were also the same people calling him an unprofessional piece of shit over the weekend. True. Says they're the same type of people that change their opinions on a dime, but then will try to convince themselves that they had it right since day one. True. Says they're all uneducated marks who don't know shit about the business. True. He essentially called out Meltzer's whole overblown fuck-off star rating system that means as much as my big turds that fall into the toilet bowl. Brings up the fact that he's the second biggest minute-for-minute draw in the company, which I guess would be behind Punk, if I had to venture a guess as to whom the number one minute-for-minute draw is. I mean, who else would be, right? And of course, things get heated once he starts bringing up all the overpaid ex-WWE guys that Tony keeps dishing out money to bring in, and currently still is as of this recording. And then he screamed into the camera for Tony to fire him because he doesn't want to be there anymore. And of course, they cut his mic and do the deadpan fade to black to make it seem like it was unforeseen and off script. I mean, if Russo had come up with it, they'd have the announcers bring it up on commentary how it wasn't part of the format. So yeah, there's AEW's second-rate attempt at the pipe bomb promo that Punk did years back. A promo that I still find highly overrated in the scope of things, but that's also irrelevant right now. But MJF, he's certainly doing the Brian Pillman character to perfection. I think the only thing missing from this was Max calling Tony Booker Man. and it would have been an all-time classic. Anyway, how you make of this is kind of dependent on where you stand with the whole MJF versus Tony Khan story. I listened to the YouTube clip of Dave Meltzer and Brian Alvarez talking about this segment, and I will say it was very insightful. Didn't agree with everything that was said, but Dave brought up a lot of good points with the comparisons to seeing this stuff pan out in WCW back in the day and how it wasn't necessarily best for business in the long term. I think it's completely absurd to think that this is going to turn out to be equivalent to an Austin McMahon level feud. For Christ's sake, you got to be kidding, right? You're telling me that they're going to try and make Tony Khan an on-screen character out of this? An on-screen heel, no less? That fucking weasel-looking priss? That guy looks like he's ready to jump out of his own skin anytime he's standing in front of a red light. Dude, after practically shitting his pants when he escorted Martha Hart out to the podium for that speech at the pay-per-view. Dude, Tony Khan should be kept as far away from a camera monitor as possible. Just, no. They're not going to try and make Tony an ongoing character on the show out of this, so just let that nonsense go because it's not going to happen. But, you know, I'm sitting there watching this and started thinking about a lot of things. You know, maybe we ought to talk about something more important. Let's just push the material aside here and just talk about the whole concept of the work shoot. And this is coming from someone that's watched a lot of wrestling in his time. You know, I grew up watching a lot of territorial tapes, studying the all-time greats, seeing how the landscape of the business changed once the marks started getting a little too close to the fire with learning about the ins and outs of the business. And it's the exact same thing that Meltzer covered in the Observer Radio this week, where he talked about seeing a lot of this stuff pan out in WCW in the late 90s and the slippery slope formula, this whole concept created for the business. And trust me, I'm by no means on the Meltzer bandwagon at this stage, especially after hearing the way him and all the goons on the Observer cover AEW on a week-to-week basis. But I listened to him and Brian cover this MJF segment, and a lot of what Meltzer said rung true. And for someone like me who considers myself someone who has enough experience watching wrestling to know when companies are barking up the wrong tree, can I just ask a simple fundamental question? And I will even address this to people that are just kind of casual wrestling fans that don't really know a whole lot about the insider terminology. Can someone please tell me when in the history of the business work shoots ever drew fucking money? Or ever put asses in seats? Are we going to pretend like we didn't already go through periods in the late 90s where they were testing the waters with all this bull crap and by and large, it never ended up being a booming success for the company? I mean, the whole premise of Russo's version of the work shoot is laughable on its face, but at least in his defense, he was already on a sinking ship by the time he got to the point where we were seeing all of his writing and bullshit ideas come to the forefront of the business, because Russo loved these work shoot things. Whether it was WWF, WCW, or TNA, it didn't matter. Russo could write stuff like this all the time, and it ended up getting to a point where the biggest joke of the matter was trying to figure whether or not people would be swerved in the storylines without seeing the actual swerve. But even so with watching this kind of stuff on television, I'm just trying to think about this as someone who doesn't know jack shit about the business and just watches wrestling because they want to see a good show. Why go down the road with all this? Like, how about you just focus on writing and producing a better wrestling show? Yeah, how about you worry about getting over your own talent and trying to use some of those supposed outdated old school mechanisms that actually used to make stars in the business and actually drew money? Do you ever think about that? I know Tony might think this is captivating or cutting edge television, and maybe if it were 30 years ago and it had never been done before and we didn't have plenty of history to demonstrate that this is not necessarily the best business model to have, then I might be willing to let it play out. But haven't we already learned by now that this exposing the business garbage isn't exactly what people want to see? Except for all the fucking losers and no-life marks that spend 24/7 watching every god-blessed bit of wrestling footage they can get their hands on. And the reality is, unless this is all leading to MJF becoming the world champion for this company before 2024, then why should anyone care about this? And where does this all go from here? So what, the story is going to be that MJF sits on his ass at home and we don't hear from him for months? Who wants to see that? Dude's been the best thing, arguably the only thing that's worth a damn on your stupid company outside Punk for months now. So now you're going to punish us all by keeping the guy off of television and continuing to subject us to all the usual nonsense we see every week on your show? Here's what I'm going to say, just to put this whole thing to bed right now. This has the potential to work in AEW's favor if the end goal is to make MJF the world champion. But let me just reiterate some key points that I talked about earlier so we're all on the same page. I've talked about this before. AEW gets mocked for being a mediocre carbon copy of WWE, especially when it comes to a lot of the presentation and booking aspects of things. The one thing that WWE never did during the entirety of the Monday Night Wars was make their show look inferior to the competition. From what I took away from MJF's promo, he's teetering on that fine line right now with making AEW out to be the heels, especially with the ex-WWE talent comment. You know, I don't want to be there. This place sucks. Like, why would you do this? It's been a common complaint for a lot of fans throughout the years, and it was really apparent in TNA around the 2010s when they were bringing in every former WWE guy that they could get their hands on, and all the TNA originals either took a backseat or never won in the end because the company was always focused on the bigger stars and established names. It's not on that same level with AEW right now, but when you start putting over other companies' established talent over a lot of your homegrown originals that you initially sold to people were going to be the future of your product, the people are going to eventually resent that. You know? The Jungle Boys, the Sammy Guevaras, the Darby Allins of the world, regardless how I might feel a lot of those guys, they do have a pretty significant place in the hearts of the AEW marks. And if you start jobbing those guys out or pushing them to the back burner for, again, the ex-WWE rejects, that's not going to go over well. I mean, wrestling fans are fucking stupid, but they also are very passionate. And especially the AEW fans, they were sold a bill of goods from the beginning. And they were told who the guys are. That whole 4 pillars discussion we always talk about, I mean, it still gets tossed around from time to time. So, be careful, guys. That's all I'm saying. You're treading in murky waters right now with all this, and if you're not careful, it could backfire and blow up in your face in more ways than you can imagine. Now, of course, they come back from commercial and draw absolutely no attention to anything we just saw with MJF, and why would we, you know? I mean, this has got to get your shit in wrestling, so we got to keep things rolling. But boy, did we keep things rolling with this goddamn great return. I'll say this. If MJF is going to be gone for a while and I'm not going to get to see him on my television on a weekly basis, at least they made up for it with the TV return of Miro. The fucking Redeemer, baby. The best TNT champion I ever saw in AEW in their 3-year history. And he's still in as good a shape as he was when I last saw him. He's jacked. He's tanned. He's moving well. Take notes, Adam Cole. Those are results you get when you actually get a gym membership. It's good to see Miro back. You know, we talk about the few redeeming qualities when it comes to this product. You know, that the segments, or the great segments aren't coming from MJF or Punk. Occasionally you throw in Danielson when he's doing stuff on his own. It's usually saved with something involving FTR or, as we found out late last year, something involving Miro. That was when Miro was on the show and wasn't stuck in purgatory for 8 months or whatever he was doing in New York with filming a movie series or something. Doesn't matter. The point is, he's back, and he had a great domination showcase here against Johnny Elite. Amira's another guy I would classify as someone who really understands the art of subtleties in the wrestling business. The facials, the timing, the pacing of his matches, everything with him matters and means something. He's not an I have to get my shit in kind of wrestler. If my entire match is just stomps and clubbing blows and big power moves, then fuck it. That's what I'm going to do, because at least the people are reacting to it. Plus, I don't have to kill myself to get over. So, this is probably my favorite thing on the entire show. I don't know what they're going to do with him, but hopefully it involves winning back the TNT title, because he'll be a hell of a lot more interesting of a champion than Scorpio Sky is. It's so far, I'm not getting a whole lot out of Johnny in AEW. I know he's only had like 2 matches, but he's also wrestled probably 2 of the better talents AEW has on their roster right now in Samoa Joe and now Miro. And in both these matches, I have not been blown away by his work. I was never a big John Morrison fan in WWE to begin with, but I mean, I've seen him have better showcases than this. I don't know if he just needs smaller opponents to feed off of, or if he just needs to take more time to work off the ring rust, but yeah, so far I'd say Morrison's 0 for 2 when it comes to good impressions on AEW TV. So then we had the Jericho Appreciation Society doing whatever sports entertainment horse shit they were going to try and spew out here. They did at least recap the Fuckfest in the Arena match from the pay-per-view, and after seeing the 60-second video pre-tape they devoted to it, I'm now glad that I was validated in skipping over that complete skid mark of a match. And I would probably use the term match loosely. And it's also good to know that Jericho is on board with the statistical evidence that sports entertainers always win over pro wrestlers. Especially with this company. God damn, is that the truth. And I think the entire segment can be summed up with the following statement. Blood and guts. Pause. And I'm pretty sure it was Tony Schiavone that just goes, what? Yeah, exactly. Oh, and apparently we're getting Jericho versus Ortiz in a hair versus hair match, because Ortiz chopped off 1.5 inches of Jericho's hair in this segment. Whatever. I am actually very interested to see if Jericho would be willing to let the babyfaces shave him bald. Like, something like that should ideally be done on a pay-per-view, or at the very least, they do it on TV, but they make sure they don't expose Jericho's bald head until the pay-per-view, so we actually have to pay to see it. But at the same time, I highly doubt that Jericho would shave his head. And then we had the funniest thing on the show by a long shot. They obviously made some modifications to the 10-man tag that they had initially announced, / false advertised, depending on how you look at it. I think initially it was supposed to be the entire Undisputed Elite versus the Hardys and the Jurassic Express. And instead it was Matt Hardy, Darby Allin, and the Jungle Book crew versus the Beta Bucks, Red Dragon, and their partner, randomly coming out with the Undisputed Era like we all knew who the fuck the guy was, Hikuleo. Who? I just thought it was one of the Wild Samoans' long-lost sons. Obviously, I'm now aware that he's the son of Haku. You know, maybe it would have been nice for them to actually mention that at some point. And instead, they're like, oh yeah, look at that. It's Hikuleo. Yeah, he's here. Y'all know who he is. Oh yes, but of course. I know exactly who that is. I dream and masturbate every night at the thought of the next time I get to see a fucking Hikuleo match. Morons. I did laugh when I saw that, though. Just the usual AEW stupidity. What else is new? Anyway, here's the extent of my notes on this match, beyond the usual AEW gymnast stunt show garbage that I'm used to seeing when they do these multi-man jumbled calamities. Adam Cole should be AEW's designated heel color commentator on every show. That way I don't have to see him on camera and I can just listen to him talk. JR has totally phoned it in. Hikuleo deserves an Emmy for the bump over the top rope where he spiked himself on his head and then bounced right back up on his feet. And Jungle Boy jobs again. And he and the Dinosaur are still the AEW tag champs right now. Why? And on that note, question for Mr. Two-Time Booker of the Year here. If the Bucks are going to be next in line for a title match now, then why the fuck did they just do a job to the Hardys on pay-per-view? Just asking. We then had Tony introducing AEW's newest signee, Athea. Athea, Athena, it's all the same. She'll be completely irrelevant in 3 months, guaranteed. And this was all centered around her calling out Jade Cargill. So I guess they're going to be feuding over the belt or something. Yippee, whatever. The best part of the whole segment was Stokely Hathaway, who... I rember he did a little bit of mouthpiece work in NXT, but I don't remember him being that good. It's a shame his debut on the pay-per-view was overshadowed so badly because he was great here. I'm not all that enthralled with the idea of this feud, but who knows, maybe Athena will actually be the one to beat Jade for the belt. Or maybe Tony will do what he did with girls like Toni Storm and Ruby Riott, where he'll just beat Athena cold and she'll cease to matter after the fact. And then he'll try to make up for it in 12 months after realizing he fucked up the first go-around. And then we had Wardlow's first match under his official AEW contract. So by that fact, wouldn't that have meant his record would have to reset? Because technically speaking, if we're buying the idea that his kayfabe contract was with MJF for the better part of 3 years, wouldn't that mean that his win-losses would reset to 0? Or maybe I'm just putting too much thought into this. Anyway, so he killed the guy in like a minute, whatever his name was, JD Drake, I don't care. And then afterwards, Mark Sterling came down to serve Wardlow for apparently having laid his hands on this special group of security for the last few weeks. So, of course, Wardlow kills all of them, or kills one of them, powerbombs him, and they immediately cut away. So, yeah, Wardlow. Big pay-per-view moment. Pretty big career highlight and blow-off feud with MJF after almost 3 years. And now he's kind of back at square one squashing dudes. I kind of hope they've got bigger plans for him. That's all I can say about it. We had... Well, I was going to jump to the girls' match, but I did briefly note... We had a segment where Dante Martin tried to act tough and cut a promo on Scorpio Sky ahead of their title match on Friday. All I can say is when Dante Martin is making Black Hole of Charisma Scorpio Sky look like a good promo, yeah, you got some problems there, Buster. And then we had Britt Baker and Jamie Hayter versus Ruby Soso and Toni Storm. Why? I don't know. I guess... They felt bad about beating Ruby and Tony in the tournament, so 50-50 booking. We put over Britt on pay-per-view when we shouldn't have, and Ruby clearly needed to win that match, so fuck it, let's just turn around and have her win here when no one could possibly care. And then we'll beat the faces like a drum afterwards anyway, so the heels can get their heat back. Whatever. I didn't pay attention to the match. I was doing other crap while it was going on. It was one of those in-the-background viewing experiences. It went on for an eternity, and most of the stuff that I saw looked sloppy and uninteresting, which is pretty much most women's matches I see in AEW, so nothing new. And then our main event was Jon Moxley versus Daniel Garcia, and speaking of being in the background, it really sucks too. 6 or 7 months ago, A Daniel Garcia match was interesting to me because he took his matches seriously and he wrestled well. In other words, he was a pro wrestler, and he had my attention because I liked his ring style. Now he's doing low-rent sports entertainment garbage. He's been linked to the sinking anchor that is anything involving Chris Jericho on this program, and now I don't care about him. And Jon Moxley sucks, so there's that. I did catch the finish where Moxley submitted Garcia, and I think off camera, Eddie Kingston had tripped running down the ramp to try and pull Jericho off the apron. Yeah, because nothing can ever go right here in AEW. There's fuck-ups left and right, nobody knows what they're doing, and everything is so haphazardly put together. But at least we can look forward to War Games. I gotta see if I can get a drop of Regal doing it because he's so much better at it. By far, I think my favorite rendition of that meme, I think this happened on NXT with the girls back in like 2018 or 2019 where they were all just brawling ringside. And then Regal just came out midway through the brawl and went, "Enough! War Games!" And there was like all the hype we got for the War Games match. It was so fucking amazing. I still remember it to this day because it was so absurd. It was like, we got a War Games pay-per-view coming up. We need a match. We need a War Games match. Girls, brawl. And then Regal just comes out and goes, "War Games!" And everyone's like, yeah! Oh, I miss NXT. The good NXT. I had mentioned it earlier. Regal tried to do the blood and guts thing. It didn't work that well. Speaking of not working well, I'm presuming the same thing will ring true when they do their second installment of JAS versus Blackpool Fight Club. At least I'd be willing to watch the War Games match because it's an actual match and not 10 dudes fucking around and hitting each other over the head with shit for almost a half hour. So, I mean, we'll see what they do with the feud, or the build to the feud. I still don't care about the program, but I don't know. Maybe they'll do something interesting. Overall, here's what I would recommend with Dynamite this week. In the case you missed it and you're asking what should I check out on the show, know going in that you are not going to get a single recap package of any fallout from the pay-per-view, aside from the 20 seconds of the Anarchy in the Arena match. And then from there, watch everything from the beginning of the show up through the Miro match, and then just turn the show off, because there's nothing else of note after that. Unless you're into those Wild Wild West cartoon brawls where everyone's just doing random shit to each other, you'll probably enjoy the 8-man tag with the Bucks. MJF continues to be the most compelling part of the show, and even if he ends up being written off of TV after this week, he will still continue to be the most compelling part of the show because, I mean, that's probably where most of the news is going to surround. And whatever happens on the actual TV show from now until the end of the year is just window dressing. Anyway, I think we're about ready to get into the classic content, so let's get going with that. Ooh, almost dumped my water over. NWA World Championship Wrestling, May 31st, 1986. Another 60-minute program this week. And as we kick off the show, our opening montage video package features a post-match assault with the Midnight Express and the James Gang, where the Midnights were able to successfully unmask one of the boys. And they'd been promising to do this on the show for several weeks now. But this was only a teaser. They were going to make us wait to see the unveiling for later on. It was quite the payoff, but we'll talk about that more when we get to it. Jumping to the booth, we had a Dusty Rhodes and Baby Doll promo. And, you know, it's funny. Dusty is one of those characters where his promos are usually one of two things. They're either filled with legendary quotes and great material that you can discuss for hours on end, or he says some stuff and you completely forget about it the second it's over. This was more geared toward the second one. He mentioned that he was ready to face Ric Flair for the World Heavyweight title, and then Baby Doll chimed in, vowing she was going to get her hands on Cornette during the Great American Bash tour. It was not as memorable as last week's promo where he was out there high-fiving fans and talking about naked people and whatever in the fuck Dusty was rambling about at the time. Our opener was Hector Guerrero in the Raging Bull versus Thunderfoot and Bob Owens. And we had seen Hector and Bull team up in a couple TV matches before. But it's been so long since we've seen Hector on the show, I had totally forgotten the pairing with him and Bull was a thing. Probably also explained why they stuck him with Jimmy Valiant for a period of time. And it's a shame that Hector never got more attention in Jim Crockett Promotions around this time, because it's always fun going back and watching his matches. Him and Manny were a solid little team for the little we ever saw of them working together. Probably my favorite part in the match is the moment where Hector was coming off the ropes going for a crossbody onto Thunderfoot, and Thunderfoot caught him in a fallaway slam position, only for Hector to then come down on Thunderfoot for a near fall. If you were not watching this spot in real time, you'd have thought David Crockett was calling the WrestleMania main event. He was so excited. And of course the Faces won after Manny hit the flying burrito on Owens. And that was followed with an Arn Anderson promo, who essentially just reiterated one of his earlier promos from last week where he vowed that Ole Anderson would be back soon. It's literally all there was to it. And this is where they showed the Ricky Morton angle, where the Horseman ran in and shattered his nose. Kayfabe, obviously. But, God, this poor Ricky Morton. He got brutalized in the year 1986. One week he's getting his face rubbed into the concrete and he's bleeding from the jaw and cheek. Next minute he's getting pinned down on the ring while Flair's driving a knee into his head and smashing his nose into the ground. Brutal. Of course, the whole time the beatdown was going on, I kept asking, where in the hell was Robert Gibson during this whole thing? Well, he showed up about a month and a half too late. And then they immediately followed that with the Rock and Roll Express doing a promo. And Ricky's got the whole gimmick at play here, coming out with the face guard and the nose protector. They added a little bit of makeup under the eyes to give off the impression that he was blackened and bruised. And this promo was all Ricky. Gibson was there, but he just kind of stood there. And they made sure to leave him out of the focus for most of it, so they could just let Ricky do the patented babyface promo, simply promising to get his revenge on the Horsemen for their actions. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, I believe he noted. He also gave us an anatomy lesson on the fact that the nose is, in fact, far from the heart. Thank you, Dr. Morton. Then we had Wahoo McDaniel versus Vernon Deaton. And by now, I have pretty much summed up most Wahoo matches on this show almost exactly how I usually sum up rock and roll tag matches. With Wahoo, it's chops, diving elbow, 1, 2, 3. Sometimes he may break out a clubbing blow, or perhaps a body scissors. But, yeah, there ain't a whole lot going on with Wahoo in 1986. That's pretty apparent by now. They did have Steve Regal come out to do a brief heat promo on Wahoo during the match. Again, for all that don't remember, him and Jimmy Garvin were actually a tag team in the AWA. I believe either 1984 or 1985. They actually ended up winning the tag belts at one point. And since Garvin's been feuding with Wahoo, they kind of planted the seed here that he was going to be watching Garvin's back. All right, then. And then we had the press conference session with Magnum TA and the Russians before the big U.S. heavyweight title match. This was, well, it was unique. I'll give it that. It was exactly how you would envision a contract signing segment in wrestling to go. Doesn't matter if it's the year 1986, 1996, 2006, 2016, or 2056. About 99.8% of the time, contract signings will evidently lead to the exact same thing every time. But this was also great because While they've got Sandy Scott running down the steps for everything, talking about how the match is set in stone for next week, June 7th, we then cut to both guys signing the paperwork. And I guess how somehow within the span of the last 7 days, Ivan Koloff has summoned the ability to speak telepathically. He begins reading over the contract, and by that I mean very briefly flipping through pages as to make it seem like he actually read the fine print when we all know he didn't. And while doing so, we hear Ivan talking, but his lips are clearly not moving. It was the weirdest thing, and I'm honestly not sure exactly how to explain why or how this was done. I also appreciated that while they were flipping through the pages to the signature section, there's a paragraph at the top of the last page with a bunch of big bolded X's going through the words. Guess that part of the contract was voided off. They just didn't have time to print off a new one. So then Nikita ends up calling Magnum a coward for bringing his mother to the contract signing. Yeah, I forgot to mention that too. Magnum's mother was sitting next to him for some peculiar reason. And while she served absolutely no purpose other than just being there, she did add some entertainment value at the end where, as Nikita and Magnum get into the proverbial brawl that we all knew was coming, Magnum's mother is standing next to the table saying something to the extent of, "Stop, don't." And I think I put more life and energy into it than she did. But hey, good news to come out of it. After about 6 months of these two cutting non-stop go-nowhere promos on each other, we are finally getting the blow-off match. And I actually did write this down with Nikita's promo, and it is a totally valid question in hindsight. Why did Magnum TA bring his mother to this contract signing? Was she a legal representative for him? Did she need to carpool for the day, and Magnum had to bring her along to the conference? I don't know the answers to these questions. Shaska Whatley wrestled Bill Mulkey. I was mostly enamored with Paul Jones and Baron Von Raschke doing the inset commentary during the match, which was hilarious for a wide range of reasons. Baron is his usual self. It's not quite like Nikita's promos because Nikita is usually totally incomprehensible. With Baron, I understand most of what he says, but he also drones on and takes about 5 months to get through a single sentence. Paul Jones, on the other hand, I can't even begin to describe him in this segment, but I think one line perfectly encapsulates the whole thing. As Shaska dumps Mulkey onto the outside concrete, Paul Jones decided to go into roid rage mode for about 2 seconds so he could get out the line, "This man is a coward. He must not be from this area." And if you're asking me to figure out what in the fuck he was talking about with that dialogue, dude, you got me. Paul Jones. I think Paul Jones might be at the top of the list for wrestlers/managers that I have completely flipped the script on going back and watching him, at least now that I'm in my early 30s. When I was a kid, I thought Paul Jones was the most inept, pointless character in this company. His entire shtick with the Army thing was essentially a Hitler cosplay, but beyond the fact that it was a total comedy act, I also never really thought much of his promos at the time. Dude, going back and watching him now, I mean, he's definitely not Jim Cornette level great, but there's no way I could not put this guy in the top 10 greatest managers of all time. It's probably a stretch, but God, was he great. And in hindsight, yeah, I could probably buy the argument that he was never really good at his job, but whenever Paul Jones is out there being wacky and being a character on screen, it's entertaining. I will give him that. And then somehow within the span of less than 2 seconds after the match, Paul Jones and the Baron completely disappear from the interview booth for a Ric Flair promo. Perhaps they're time travelers. But, I was just talking about Dusty's promos at the beginning here, how sometimes they were money and other times they were just kind of there. I wouldn't say this was a bad Ric Flair promo, but I mean, am I missing something, or did he really not say anything of interest at all? He talked about his custom suit, which he normally does. He talked about the Ricky Morton angle, said it was perfectly justified, and that Arn and Tully were merely there to congratulate Flair before they all wound up ganging up on Morton. He and David got into a pretty funny little spout where Flair was basically daring David to ask him a question because he could see that David was clearly disgusted with him. And then David's question is, why four of you? Had a long time to mull that one over. And then Flair pulled out a baby-sized bathing suit, since Morton is apparently into the teeny boppers, which was not quite as unsettling as the promo from a few weeks back where Ricky pulled out a giant red thong and made fun of Flair for liking big girls. This one was at least cute and harmless enough. And then we had JJ and Tully out for a promo. And this was another house show segment where they showed a great little angle with Ron Garvin. It was supposed to be Garvin wrestling one of the usual jobbers we see on the studio shows, but they both got their fists taped up for this one. And meanwhile, Tully is on the ring apron with his arm in a sling, while JJ is in the ring talking with the job guy, I guess trying to prep him for the match. And of course, they skip ahead in the tape where Garvin's got the poor guy backed into the corner, and he's throwing lariats. The job guy's a total bloody mess. And this all leads to JJ trying to hit the ring for the blatant DQ. JJ tries to hit Ronnie with the dress shoe, but Ronnie thwarts him. He ends up throwing JJ into Tully, who falls off the apron onto the concrete. And then as Tully climbs back into the ring and starts wailing away on Ronnie, clearly establishing that the arm cast was a work the whole time. The dastardly prick. But as he's beating on Ronnie and getting the heat, he reveals that he had his fist taped underneath the cast. And all the while, Tully's cutting the promo over the footage the entire time this is going on. And he's just spitting and fuming over the whole thing. He's screaming about how it's only athletic tape. It's not an illegal weapon. It's totally justifiable to use in matches. Just being a total condescending heel. It's fucking amazing. And upon leaving, Ronnie laying flat on his back in a heap, Tully also had to get out the line at the end where he said that while Ronnie was laying there motionless, he could audibly hear him utter the words, "I quit," to Tully. What a dick. I love this guy. Tully Blanchard was pretty awesome. I can't say that enough. He's a completely useless manager in 2022, but when he was in his prime as a wrestler, yeah, that guy was pretty fantastic. Then we had a classic wrestling moment. At the time it happened, most people probably looked sideways at the whole thing because it kind of came out of nowhere, but this was indeed the official 605 Superstation debut of Big Bubba Rogers alongside Jim Cornette. Of course, we know him as Ray Traylor, who had been doing a bunch of squash matches on the show in recent months, but this was the official repackage of Bubba. Because as you might all recall, if you were watching around this time, Bubba Rogers, Big Boss Man, whatever you want to call him, guy was really talented. Especially for a moderately big guy. He had size, but he was agile. And at this point, I forget offhand how old he was at the time, but it had to have been his early 20s, right? Like 21, 22, 23. And considering how new he still was to the business, the fact that they saw something in this guy that early on goes to show how great they were at scouting talent back in the day. Wasn't a whole lot to the initial intro of Bubba here. That kind of came after the next match. It was the Midnights wrestling Art Pritz and Brody Chase. And Yeah, it was mostly uninteresting. Other than the job guys being fucking horrible at their jobs, I think my favorite part was the last minute where Dennis went to give Brody the reverse Russian leg sweep, Jeff Jarrett's old finishing move, and after Brody totally botched taking the face first bump, Dennis made sure to kick him in the back before tagging in Bobby so he could hit the flying elbow for the 3. Dennis was so great. And then they had a fantastic little post-match interview with the Midnights, Cornette and Bubba. This is where Corny revealed Bubba as his personal bodyguard, so that he was his mother's personal debt collector for a period of time. And I mean, I'll say this because I am somewhat of a wrestling critic, and I do like to call attention to logic gaffes and quirky things we see in the business. I probably shouldn't leave this out. Granted, if you were watching at the time and you were completely ignorant to the fact that Bubba had been working jobs on the show for several weeks prior to this gimmick, you probably wouldn't have thought twice about the whole thing. Just, oh, look, a new tall guy we've totally never seen on the show before. Now, as we look back with modern eyes, we cock our heads sideways at it, thinking, did we not just see this guy doing jobs on the show under a completely different name less than a month ago? And now all of a sudden he's Corny's personal muscle and has familial ties? Well, yeah, pretty much. I mean, we have seen plenty of worse repackages in modern times. Elias becoming Ezekiel on Raw ring a bell for anyone? Or pretty much anyone that got rebranded in WWF from the late 80s to the early 90s coming off the territory scene? Anyway, the more important thing is that we finally got the full tape of the unmasking of one of the James Gang members. And the revelation we all didn't see coming, as it turns out, one half of the James Gang was in fact Tony Zane all along. Knew it. And he would have gotten away with it if it weren't for those meddling kids. And see, this is why Cornette is an all-time great. Say what you want about him. I listen to him every week with Brian Last. Love his podcast. He has a great mind for the business. Great wrestling historian. Don't always agree with everything he says, but the one thing you can't argue with Cornette is that the guy knew how to be his character to the fullest effect. And, when he's standing there stumbling and tripping over himself, trying to counter-argue Tony Schiavone, who's explaining that the footage clearly shows that the James Gang were not Dusty and Magnum, but Cornette's so enraged and furious about being duped, he just keeps flubbing his lines during the rebuttal. Dude, this is pro wrestling. This is real, authentic, honest-to-God, professional fucking wrestling. And I don't care what anyone says. Baby Doll going out there and making the challenge to Corny to fight her at the Great American Bash, and Cornette's so overwhelmed and flustered with everything, he just accepts the fight with her. God, this is the chef's kiss. Calling her a fat hog or whatever he said. And you know what, man? My hat's off to Baby Doll for being down with all the slandering and the derogatory comments she got thrown her way back in the day. She was a real trooper for going along with this. Letting people calling her fat on live television like that. Especially when you compare that to today's hostile environment with the way people are allowed to portray women on television. Like, I don't even know if you're allowed to say anything in the ballpark like the shit Cornette used to say about Baby Doll back in the day anymore. And then coming back from the break, we had precious and gorgeous Jimmy Garvin out for a promo. As I wrote down here, doing the exact gimmick that Sammy Guevara and Ty Conti are trying to portray on television, except they fucking suck at it. And I think they're supposed to be babyfaces. But these two are also great here. Once again, Garvin throwing shade at Baby Doll for being out here trying to get with all the men. And speaking of things that totally wouldn't fly on TV anymore, I think there was something in this promo about comparing Wahoo to men that used to get tied to trees and whipped when they did not pick enough cotton back in the day. Yeah. I think that's all I'm going to say about that. Definitely not something that would pass the initial script stages for television these days. Then we had the Rock and Roll Express beat Paul Garner and David Dillinger with the double drop kick. And remember how my ongoing gimmick with the rock and roll squash matches is writing down the exact same verbiage every time? Double drop kick, 1, 2, 3. Well, guess what I wrote down about this? Exactly. And for the record, if you think I'm glossing over anything, I'm not. That was the whole match. And then following that, we had Ivan and Nikita at the booth. And beyond letting us know that Crutcher Khrushchev is on his way back, they really didn't say anything important. Although hearing Ivan call out David Crockett for being prejudicial and pro-babyface was kind of funny. Especially if you've been watching the show lately. And then we jump back to the ring for the Barbarian and Baron Von Raschke versus Rocky King and the Italian Stallion. Watching the Barbarian do a one-handed press slam on Rocky, impressive. I believe this was also the match on the show where they had the Great American Bash hotline number that people could call to get notifications and updates on the tour. And of course, they had the number blurred out on Peacock for obvious reasons. But it was also great because I believe there were like 2 or 3 instances where Tony and David were actually reading the number aloud, but they also took the audio out there. So there were like random points during the action where it was just silence for about 5 or 6 seconds, and then they would cut the audio feedback in again. The heels won after Baron used the black glove gimmick on one of the job guys, and then Barbarian hit a flying headbutt. We also had a classic Tony Schiavone moment here where early on, Shaska Whatley came over to the booth and started doing the standard loud, obnoxious banter that we're accustomed to hearing now. And after Shaska finishes and walks away, Tony casually lets us all know that was Shaska Whatley, everyone. Thank you for the clarification, Tony. Never would have figured that one out. This is where they had the Great American Bash update. And the main message we got out of this is the announcement that Ric Flair will be defending the World Heavyweight title on 14 different occasions in the 30-day span of the tour. And the regulations are, if Flair happens to drop the strap during one of those 14 title defenses, then the title matches will continue with whoever happens to be the champion at the time. Now, if you all know your NWA history, you remember how this all went down. I was more so fixated on the fact that they had their world champion defend the title 14 times in a month span. Good grief, I think Adam Page was the AEW world champion for something like over 6 months. I think I remember him defending the title on like 4 or 5 times in a half-year time span. Meanwhile, Flair's doubling, almost tripling those title defenses in 30 days for a tour. Of course, this is also back in the day where the belts actually meant something, so there's that. And then Ron Garvin wrestled Ken Glover, won with a knockout punch in 20 seconds. That's all there was to that. And then Corny returned to the booth for one final promo, vowing and promising to embarrass and beat Baby Doll, saying there's no way on God's green earth that a woman is beating a man in a legit fight. And then he starts getting into a fiery spiel on President Bob Geigel, and it became apparent pretty quickly that they were low on time, so Corny had to pretty much wrap up things as abruptly as possible. So his closing lines here, as Tony tells the fans that we're out of time and we'll see you next week, Corny just goes, "Yes, we will." What a fucking great line. And what a great fucking show. I mean, the matches were pretty forgettable, but when you talk about angles and promos, if you love old school talking segments and angles on your wrestling shows, this is one you need to check out. The reduction in time may have had something to do with it too, but the show flies by. It's fun. Things are paced well. They make sense. The characters are great. The stories are explained well. I understand what's going on in each segment, and they make sure that everything being presented matters. It's exactly what I talked about in the Double or Nothing recap after running down the MJF Wardlow match. The best thing on that entire show by a country mile. When wrestling is done well, it's usually when things are not overly complicated for the fuck all of it. It's the simplistic stories that make all the difference in the world because they're easy to follow, the people can relate, they can get into the characters because there's a distinguished bad guy and a distinguished good guy, and when the bad guy gets theirs in the end, the people go crazy for it. It's not that hard. It's why these NWA shows are easy to watch. I know who the good guys are, I know who the bad guys are, I know their motives, I know their goals, and I care about the end results. Excellent stuff. And speaking of good stuff, that'll bring us to World Class Championship Wrestling from June 4th, 1983. And we open the show with glitchy technology. It's pretty amazing. It's also why WWE goes out of their way to let everyone know in the opening graphics of the upcoming technical difficulties we're going to be encountering throughout the shows. Because, you know, the 80s were rough. Definitely when it came to quality recording equipment. And the ironic thing is, compared to most territories around this point, I think World Class had the reputation for being the one territory in the States with real, actual quality recording equipment. The opener for the week was Chris Adams versus Bill Ratke. Short little squash deal for Adams. Not all that much to elaborate on it. Although it did get me thinking during this match. Obviously, Chris Adams became a mainstay with World Class and a lot of the other Texas regions for pretty much the majority of his career. And I remember there's like a million things he ends up getting involved with during his time there, especially once he starts getting more involved with the Von Erichs. I think he ends up feuding with Jimmy Garvin at one point too. So far, he's done pretty much nothing of value though. He showed up in, I believe, early or mid-April of 83. Had a series of vignettes with Bill Mercer. He had that one blow-off with the Mongol, and that's pretty much all. Aside from a couple weekly squashes here and there. I mean, I guess without looking at spoilers or looking ahead at anything, yeah, I'm trying to remember how long it took for him to start getting more focus in those higher profile matches. It's just weird. And then we had Kamala/Kimala versus Johnny Rich, which, again, was a pretty nothing-happening squash. The match actually went about as long as it took Friday to take off all Kamala's gimmicks before the bell. And whereas in previous weeks, they had been doing a little story with Kamala going off the hinges in his segments, bloodying dudes up, laying out managers, etc. Here it was basically a normal squash. Mercer did announce during the match that Kamala was slated to wrestle 3 men at the Reunion Arena Star Wars event on June 17th, although at the time they were not aware of his opponents. Ooh, the suspense builds. Although if you've been following the shows recently, you've got to assume it involves Arman Hussein and Yatsu in some capacity. Not sure about the third guy, but guess we'll find out soon. Then we had David Von Erich on the ranch. And that's exactly what it was. World-class home movies. It's pretty much the whole deal. We learned in the segment that Mercer is an expert horseback rider. So he and David were going to take a ride around the ranch with the baby horses accompanying. And they basically just covered David's goals to be the Texas and World Heavyweight Champion. They got the low-key country music droning in the background. It's like the most peaceful thing you could ever imagine with a wrestling show. It's almost kind of out of character. And they do the classic little outro guitar riff right before cutting to break. And you see David and Mercer kind of riding off into the sunset. God, World Class making their own little mini movies back in the day with these vignettes. I think I've covered this before, talking about the way they used to air pre-tapes, but they're like the most simplistic thing in the entire world. Like this one is just David and Bill riding horses on the ranch, talking about David wanting to be the world champion, and that's it. The whole thing probably took less than 15 minutes to film, but I mean, I got more out of it than most of the video packages I saw in that AEW pay-per-view over the weekend. You can add all the glitz and glamour you want to that Adam Page CM Punk promo. I still had absolutely no clue why Page was pissed at Punk. Here, I at least knew what David's goals were and started with becoming the Texas Heavyweight Champion and beat Jim Garvin so he can move on to the bigger and better things. It's not that hard. And then we had our first double main event, essentially, for the week. It is Michael Hayes versus Kerry Von Erich. Another announcement here from Bill Mercer, where they explain that the Freebirds are defending the American Tag Titles against Kerry and a partner of his choosing to be announced. So it wouldn't have been Kevin then? Actually, now that I think about it, no, I think Kevin wrestled Ric Flair for the world title at the Star Wars show. And David wrestled Garvin again, so yeah, that would probably make sense. Probably the most rational option at that point would be the Iceman then, right? I don't know. We'll find out. By the way, just throwing this out there in case you need a clarification. Yes, I had totally forgotten that the Freebirds were the tag champions in Dallas. Although, I mean, when you look at the roster at this point, who else would it have been beside the Von Erichs? Basically, here's my short and sweet summary of the entire match. For a match that had nuclear heat, they did effectively nothing. That's not really exaggerating either. Kerry controlled the action early on. Hayes stalled on the outside. He worked over Kerry's knee at one point for a little bit of heat. And after trying to pick up Kerry for a suplex to bring him back into the ring, Kerry fell on top of him for the slip on the banana peel finish. Except in this case, I think Kerry just used the momentum of getting picked up to just come landing down on Hayes. And then they did the post-match interview where the heels mocked Kerry for having no tag partner and that he wasn't going to find one in time for the show. Because, you know, it's clearly been established that the Von Erichs have no friends in world class. There's not a single person on that entire roster that would ever want to step up and team with Kerry to get their hands on those dastardly Freebirds. And the main event, gorgeous Jim Garvin versus David Von Erich for the recently vacated Texas Heavyweight title. And, you know, at this stage with reviewing Jimmy Garvin matches, both on this show and the NWA WCW shows, I could probably just say it's a Jim Garvin match. It's 5 stars. Good night, everyone. Don't forget to tip the waiter. But, well, of course, we're trying to be detailed here on the 5 Starr Wrestling Report with our retro reviews. Don't want to get lazy or anything, am I right? Again, I can't reiterate enough how awesome Sunshine is at ringside reacting to everything that's going on. There's a point early in this match where David was working over Garvin on the mat in a toe hold, and they cut to Sunshine, who's got the best panic-stricken expression going on. And while keeping the camera on her momentarily, never taking it off of her for a single moment, her expression immediately goes to pure joy because when they cut back to the ring, Garvin is now working over David on the mat. I have no idea what Garvin did to get the momentum back in his favor, but it did not matter because Sunshine was elated. So we knew that the heel was in control at that point. God, she's so good. The big angle of the match is the spot toward the end where David gives Garvin the running knee toward the ropes. He goes for the cover, but that no good little dirty Jezebel, Sunshine, puts Jimmy's foot on the ropes. The gall of this woman. Someone ought to spank her and put her in her place. So, of course, David goes out to chase her, and she ends up scurrying into the ring where David stalks her into the corner. And, well, first off, Bronco Lubick just calls for the DQ. He's like, yeah, fuck that, we're not doing this. Ring the bell. Like, if this were any other promotion today, you could have the entire roster setting off fireworks and storming the ring with guns and knives, and unless someone actually used the gimmick on someone in the match, only then would it be grounds to throw the match out. And then this leads to Garvin spinning David around, trying to get the jump on him, but David immediately locks in the claw for basically a split second before getting dumped over the top rope by Garvin. So the heels bail. David's trying to call BS on the whole deal with Bronco. And yeah, it was a little main event angle. The title remains vacant in the interim until they get a ruling on where to go from here. I also enjoyed Jimmy's interview with Mercer at the commentary desk afterwards, where Jimmy is pleading his case that he was screwed. It's a grave miscarriage of justice because everybody saw that Jim Garvin was clearly in control of that match, and he would have won. He should be the Texas Heavyweight Champion. I think he's lying. In fact, I can confirm 100% undoubtedly he's lying. But he's a heel, so it's okay. We'll give him a fair pass. Overall, this is a good show, though. First couple squashes weren't all that interesting, but the two main events were great. It continues to astound me how the Freebirds Von Erich story is still as hot as it is right now. If they did this exact program in 2022, I'd have been overseeing the constant matchups between these teams probably like 3 months ago by now, but hey, different time, I guess. I mean, if you watch Raw these days, I'm sure you get shit like this every week, except whereas with the Von Erich Freebirds matches, they at least mix things up and add gimmicks every now and then to keep it fresh. If they were booking this on Raw, you'd be seeing Michael Hayes versus Kerry Von Erich in a straight wrestling match for 6 weeks in a row with the same garbage DQ finish. There you go. I threw some shade at WWE. I'm not always doing the one-sided AEW sucks comparisons. Believe me, I am a fair and impartial man. Anyhow, guess we're done for this one. Thanks for stopping in to this edition of the FSWR podcast. We will be back on Monday for the Rampage, Power, and Hell in a Cell report. And no, I'm not doing a preview predictions for the Hell in a Cell show like I did the AEW pay-per-view. See, that would imply that I've been watching Raw or SmackDown and have any vested interest in seeing who goes over in what program. Doesn't matter to me. Just as long as Cody beats Seth inside the cell, that's all I really care about. I have no idea what's going on that show aside from that one match, and honestly, I'm tempted not to Google it beforehand. Just go in blind and see how many goddamn rematches are still going to be carrying over from the Backlash show. But definitely stop back on Monday and check out that report, because it'll be a doozy. Anyway, take care, everyone. Peace.